Hi, folks. How's it going? How you feeling? Good. Okay, cool. I'm so glad and honored that you would all join us this evening. Hopefully, we're going to get to explore some really important ideas today. I know that the atmosphere lately, sort of socially and societally, is a little bit tense. There's a strong sense that the end of days is nigh. And so we want to have some fun with that, you know? Just a couple of chuckles with it. I know that in particular in the United States, things are a little bit tricky, and I do want to point out that Canada is obviously not the United States. We have our own culture, we're doing our own thing, but that we are also not necessarily immune to American culture and some of the polarization and the resulting politicization of public health institutions that can fall out of that. But that may or may not be the case. Those are intuitions. Intuitions are not data, and so we're going to kind of try to dive into that. We want to explore, I've got a little list here actually. Tonight we want to explore sort of how we rebuild trust, what building trust looks like, the strategies that are effective, how we do that in an environment that is really polarized. And to help me do that, I've got some outstanding panelists. And so I'm going to invite them to describe themselves a little bit. And let us all know sort of what they spend their time doing and their work hours. So I guess I'll start with you, Lychee.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lychee Fan. I'm an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in Technology and Social Change. And my primary expertise is AI. So lots to talk about there. But I also come to you as one of the co-directors of our Trust Network. And that's an acronym because, I don't know, people love acronyms. It stands for Trust and Research Undertaken in Science and Technology. And we're really trying to investigate and improve public trust in science and technology. I'm very lucky to have as my co-director Nobel laureate Donna Strickland. So if you keep an eye out for any of our events, there's another chance for you to meet a Nobel potentially. I think that's good for now. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, it's a pretty big mic drop to end on with a Nobel laureate, so that's great. Calvin, why don't we go with you next?
Hello. My name is Calvin Hudson Wong. I'm a film, television director and producer. My primary focus is really telling stories related to health, health access, health systems, and health equity. We've recently done some films into such interesting topics as vaccine hesitancy, metastatic breast cancer, disinformation as it relates to mental health, and recently, menopause. So I have kind of a broad range into different perspectives. I get the joy of translating science and medicine into the language of how everyday consumers experience it, and also get to criticize how we're not doing it very well in the same breath. And we've done some great award-winning films as well. So very pleased to be here with this group.
He did one on Ozempic that you should really check out as well. That one's
yes,
on the CBC.
That's correct. We did one on Ozempic. It just aired 2 weeks ago on CBC. Like that, yeah. So yeah, please check it out.
Sabina, why don't we go with you next?
Hi, everyone. Really nice to see a room full of people who actually care about science. So you guys rock. I have a degree in clinical pharmacology and toxicology. I worked in biotech for a very long time. I ended up leaving, and I'm now doing my doctor of public health. I love talking about science. It's probably one of the things that my husband says I cannot talk a lot about at home. He gives me time limits, like, you know, time limits on your phone on how much you can use on Instagram. I get time limits on how much science I can talk at home. But I love talking about vaccine mis and disinformation particularly. I have a platform called Unambiguous Science where I do a lot of this work. I'm also the co-founder of the South Asian Health Network, where we also talk about vaccines a lot. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. There's 2 of the things I do in the sciences, but I think people in sciences do a lot in sciences and different hats.
We're notorious multitaskers, not really good at focusing in on one thing. So our goal tonight is going to be to make sure that you walk out of here with a good understanding of where trust in public institutions actually is, what kinds of strategies you as individuals can apply when you go back out into the world, and how you can change your little corner of the world for the better, and the hope that if we collectively all do enough, then we can start to turn things around. My own background is studying affective polarization, so I study, you know how you go home for Thanksgiving and things are going great, and then you have that uncle that says that thing that makes everyone all tense? That's the problem I'm trying to solve. So Thanksgiving's coming up. I don't know if I'm going to make it in time, but I'm doing my best. And so part of what I look at is what's happening in the United States right now. RFK Jr. was appointed to the Secretary of Health, and he and President Trump were making some statements about the effects of Tylenol. I mean, I'm not saying anything that any of you in here are surprised about. And so I think a lot of people are worried that that kind of institutional creep might make its way up north, and that as a consequence, Canadians' trust in our public institutions might fall. As I said before, intuition is not data, so our sense that that is happening is not the same thing as that happening. And Lychee, you just published an entire report exploring exactly this topic. My first question is, do Canadians actually trust our institutions? Do they trust science? Is it as bad as it looks in the States up here?
Okay, so we did do a survey focused on Canadians and the Canadian public trust. I think within your question asking whether or not Canadians believe in science, if they trust science, versus whether or not they trust institutions, those are actually two different types of audience, or two different areas of trust. So actually, we found that by and large, Canadians trust science and scientists quite, more than we thought. Definitely more than we thought, and within that,
how much more?
Not as much as you'd think. So like 50 or 60% of trust.
Okay.
But within that, the highest range is definitely for medical professionals. Those with medical expertise have the most, are reported to have the most trust, but by the Canadian public, and that we might differentiate that from, let's say, public health institutions, including those which might be associated with the Canadian government. And the government was the government and political leaders were the group that had the lowest degree of trust, closer to being in the 20s and 30s.
So people seem to kind of trust their doctor, who they know, but if it's a public health campaign saying we should all do this, then they're a bit more reluctant?
Yes, and I think a lot of it has to do with, even in the structure that you just described, a sort of top-down message versus one-to-one. When you know somebody and you have a relationship with a doctor, your doctor or any doctor that you may meet, and you get to interact with them and ask questions, it might also feel like there's a little bit more agency for you versus when you are being told what is something you should be doing, or something that is an update, or something you should believe. So there's certainly a structural issue there in how we're seeing people respond. And I'm sure we can get into many different examples of this, but as an example, there was, let's say, degrading trust during the COVID-19 pandemic because of the appearance of what looked like changing information. But there's, in that sense, I think researchers would argue this as well, there's a little bit of a tension between what the public wants to hear, right? Give us the information. What do we need to know? And that's a valid request versus the scientific process, which is, this is what we found this week, this is what we found this week, and there's an updating of information. But those two things are not always, they don't at first sight look like they agree with each other, because it might look like there's a degree of uncertainty. But really, we know as much as we possibly can. Like, we are as up to date as possible. And uncertainty does not necessarily mean unreliability. And that's something that scientific experts need to be able to communicate. But often that the information doesn't get filtered to you, or it doesn't come to you directly from scientists and scientific experts. It may come to you as filtered and as made more accessible through, for instance, the media or social media and other people who are trained in or who are giving or trying their best shot at communicating science and making it make sense. Yeah, I think that's...
One of the ideas that I have tried to express ad nauseum many times before is that science is not what you think, it's how. It's the process that we go through to try to understand the world, and it's a process that doesn't have an endpoint. It's a process of sort of iterative refinement. So I'm curious, when you are doing your survey and you're talking to people and you're asking them, do they trust in science, what do you take science to mean, or what do you think that they take science to mean? Do they understand science to mean, well, it's the stuff that I learned in my textbooks, it's the endpoints, it's the speed of light or the shape of a benzene molecule, or do they take it to mean, like, I trust in the process of science? Do you have any insight about how they're interpreting it?
I don't think that we have not investigated into the distinction between how they're understanding science itself. However, we and others, including public health officials and researchers, have found disparities and disagreements in how people understand even the word evidence, even the word proof, and also the ways in which they receive data. So there is absolutely, I think the example you gave of science in a textbook has a certain amount of finality to it. It's what we see, what we have announced ourselves to know at this point, and we want to think that then that's the final word, at least until things get updated. But if the updating speed comes if the rate of updating is at a speed that makes people uncomfortable, then suddenly that can start to shake trust, especially when the process is as rapid as week-to-week changes as we saw with the global pandemic.
Yeah, I think that uncertainty can be disquieting for people. I mean, I just found out that Tylenol is not safe. I'm not gonna even make the joke. So I mean, you mentioned that there was sort of a degradation of trust in science around the pandemic. I'm curious whether or not that's bounced back at all since then, like whether we've seen a resurgence of trust in it. And from both your perspective and from yours, Sabina, as well, I mean, you're on social media. Does it seem like the people you're interacting with are curious about interacting with public health officials and like are curious about the science? Do they seem to trust the things that you have to share? Have you seen any changes across since the pandemic?
I think from my perspective, in the last 6 months, I've actually seen an even higher degree of polarization. The folks who's...
Oh, good news.
I know, it's great. The folks who always believed in science are even more so now believing in science, and the folks who did not believe in science are getting further away. So in short, I would say things are a bit of a dumpster fire. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, that's the fair characterization, I'd say, yeah. Okay, is that what the data shows as well, dumpster fire? Are we, like, did we see any resurgence in trust? Or?
I think the study should be done intermittently to see what changes have occurred since, especially because what was happening to us in 2020 was a very different reality from 2023, and also different age groups would have different reactions to medical information, to outlets of information. The nature of how we receive that information has also changed, so whoever's watching and looking for this on television might be very different from if they're getting their information on TikTok, in which case not only does platform matter, but also the ways in which information is being represented. We do see varying trust even across platforms, and that's something to take into account, including the regulations and norms for information communication on something like TikTok versus Instagram versus Facebook versus a newspaper, and so on and so forth.
Can I just quickly also add?
Please, yeah.
I think groups are also not a monolith, and I think we make that mistake very often. And when we see, okay, there's 2 groups here, and there's not. I know I sort of alluded to there being 2 groups, but they're not. So we saw during COVID, right? You had the folks who were the ones who had distrust in institutions because they had systemic issues. They had less access to healthcare. There was a whole host of reasons as to why there was distrust there. You had that happening with a lot of the racialized communities. We saw it with the South Asian community. I did a vaccine education session with the Punjabi community that I belong to. And the first question that I received at the end of that was, why should I trust the government to take this vaccine when they've not had my best interests at heart throughout the entire pandemic, right?
Yeah.
And so so that's another group. And then, of course, you have groups. I'm doing a study right now looking at why people follow science communicators. And what comes up from here, from this group particularly, the science-loving group, is that they felt the government during COVID did not do justice. There was a lot of both-sidism, a lot of false equivalency to try and pretend the pandemic is over, move on because of lobbying efforts from businesses, et cetera, right? And so these are all multiple different groups, and they actually all require different approaches. But we keep throwing this one-size-fits-all, hoping to slam it and fix it, and we just can't do it because it's not a monolith.
Right. I see you nodding along, Calvin. I mean, it's when I think about, I think your point is well taken that, you know, if the government that was encouraging us to take vaccines happened to be the Russian government, I can imagine how it's reasonable all of a sudden to become a bit more skeptical of whether or not your government has your best interest at heart. And so with that in mind, you know, we're all trying to figure out how we can talk to various publics in ways that that resonate with them. You've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to communicate in various visual media in ways that don't inadvertently paint you as a them and not an us, like as somebody who's untrustworthy. What are the strategies that you're using to do that? How do you make sure that you're not like in league with Bill Gates, who's putting microchips in our arms?
Well,
He is, by the way. I want that on camera. No, I'm just kidding.
I
No, it's
can't
fine.
disclose that. NDA. No, I'm just kidding. I would say my first barrier going into the anti-vax community was I'm Asian, and so there's a lot of paranoia that it's a Chinese virus, that it's the Wuhan whatever. So that was an initial barrier. But the biggest component around introducing and speaking to them is really just engaging. It's around finding common ground and really agreeing with them. So the first thing, even if they say something outrageous, you have to validate that, whether it's the experience or it's not necessarily the facts, because those are often misplaced, but it's really validating that their experience, that yeah, you've had a trauma, you've had a negative experience with either a regulatory, an authority, a government, perhaps you are in a political affiliation where you feel big government is a negative, so you have very sort of anti-authoritarian sort of or libertarian type of viewpoints. And we found a ton of those in those communities, which I mean, I grew up in Canada. I don't necessarily believe a lot of the things, but it's really around, okay, well, I see what you've gone through, and you appreciate that without any really judgment. So you're, in a way, you're building that trust by, therefore, first validating them, because I think anyone experiencing any negative trauma needs to be seen. I think the other component of that is really acknowledging what identity they choose to hold, and holding that as equally as valuable to you or to yourself, or respecting it as much as they want that to be respected. So whether they're in a religious or a faith-based group, whether they're an ethnocultural group, whether they are one who is disenfranchised in a social economic group, you have to be mindful of those microaggressions or the perceptions that you pursue, so that you can become part of that community and earn your way as part of that in-group. So it's a lot of work. There's a lot of engagement. That's time and luxury that we have as filmmakers, documentarians. It's not always one where public servants or public health has the opportunity, and they're hardly staffed and they're hardly resourced to do that. So it is labor intensive, but it is necessary work. And as Sabina was saying, it is not a monolith. The statistic around how is our relationship with science, that's an average. You need to look at the mean, you need to look at the mode, and really see where that spread is, because that will identify the different sub-communities, because they're very, very isolated. Many of them are in their own media channels. They have their own social norms, their own traditions, their own community centers and meeting points. So we no longer have everyone watches the 6 o'clock news. We no longer have Seinfeld, where everyone tunes in at a specific time, right? So we don't have these cultural things that ground us into sort of a cultural norm of how we behave, what commonalities, what events we sort of witness together. So you do have to do a lot of, for me, it was doing the research and understanding those communities beforehand, and then going in and working to establish those relationships through time and through commonality.
I think for a lot of people that idea is infuriating, though, right? That the idea that you would have to validate that, that I saw. I think the most outrageous conspiracy theory I saw was birds are fake or space is fake, and a lot of people would say like, why should I spend time validating the idea that space is fake? Like, that's a waste of my time. So can you kind of distinguish for us the difference between validating and agreeing, and why one might be actually pretty important?
Yeah. Well, first thing, birds are fake is satire.
Yes, it was. That's true.
It is purely trolling to prove the point of the outrageousness of what people believe. But
Space is fake is real, though.
yeah. But your original question, like, it's really, like, how do I re-articulate that?
Well, how do you speak, what do you have to say to people who say, I'm not interested in doing that, I don't want to spend the time, it's so much energy on my part to kind of lean into that and say like, yeah, I'm gonna pat you on the back and say like, I understand when some of the ideas that, yeah.
So it's not about, you're not necessarily fawning, you're not being obsequious, and you're not flattering. I think what you're doing is you're looking for, not necessarily what the data or what they're saying, it's around what's that emotional truth behind why they're saying it. So what is that lever to say, this is why I'm so angry at X, Y, Z. This is why I think vaccines are bad for my children. So it's around the root of like, okay, I understand I'm validating. It's good that you have these concerns about being a mother and making sure that your child's priority, that you're investing in things. What have you learned from that? What have you done? What are your resource sources? So you're not necessarily disagreeing and say, well, no, they're fine for your kids. That's immediately saying, you're out-group, I can't listen to you, you don't validate my experiences. It's really saying, yeah, I see you want to be a better parent, you value your children, let's start there. So it really is that entry point to say, emotionally, we're connected now. The data may be completely different, but yes, you want to be a good mother. That's a very valiant and noble endeavor. Let's start there.
I think that really resonates with me. I mean, one of the most valuable lessons I've ever learned in science communication, this is maybe the truest thing that I know about it, is that before people care what you believe, they must believe that you care. Before they care what you believe, they must believe that you care. And I'm curious, when you're communicating on social media and you're trying to reach out to people who aren't expressing, let's say, care or a concern for you, how can you meet that? Like, you get genuine death threats. Is it reasonable to express concern, compassion, and care? Like, do you look at it as a sort of utilitarian? What are the strategies you're using to sort of bring down the temperature, to depoliticize the conversation, and to bring some reason back into the conversation?
I think it really depends on the person and what their intentions are, right? There are folks who are out there who are just not willing to listen to anything you're going to say, and expending your energy is likely not going to get you anywhere. So people who are very obviously not there to have a conversation, I don't have a conversation. I actually stop the conversation. I block it because there's absolutely no point in going forward. The folks who come in saying, I am worried about this. This is something that's a huge concern to me. I'll give you an example. I had someone who hit my DMs saying, I am really concerned about fertility and the COVID-19 vaccine. I got a really bad period after I had my COVID-19 vaccine. I spoke to my doctor. My doctor completely dismissed it. And I actually am trying to get pregnant, and now I don't want to get my second dose. This was after the first dose, right? And I had this long conversation because this person's like, I'm not going for any more doses. Right? And I had this long conversation with them, and I said, look, here's the thing, right? We don't know whether the COVID-19 vaccines actually can impact menstrual cycles, but it's plausible. It's plausible because your endometrium lining is chock full of immune cells. We see that with things like stresses. We see it with other vaccines. So yeah, there is a potential that maybe your menstrual cycles weren't impacted by the vaccine, but here are the reasons why we don't think it's actually going to impact downstream fertility, and I list all of them, right? This is way before Health Canada came out and said, okay, well, there's a study. Yeah, your period can be a little impacted, which it was, right? And so the issue is, at that point when she had that conversation with the healthcare providers in her group, she was not taken seriously. And that conversation is important. I did not convince her that first conversation. And the point is, we have to keep having those conversations, having that second conversation, and then from the second one, having that third conversation.
Right.
That is the important part. So you keep having these conversations with them and addressing the concerns and fears they have, and then you will actually end up convincing them, right? And so she did end up getting all her vaccines. She still gets her boosters. But it took multiple conversations because I knew she was in there to actually want to have that discussion with me.
Well, so I love that. I mean, you were extraordinarily patient there, and so you spoke a little bit about there are folks with whom you have limited patience, and so sometimes they earn a block. But one of the things we were talking about before this panel started was the idea that large-scale public health campaigns can be derailed by the small group of people that are on one extreme end. And so, as much as we like to try to sort of focus our attention on the movable middle, you, to a degree, can't ignore the people on the extreme. So this is, I guess, a question to everybody. What do we do about that? We can't ignore them in some way. And so, what are the strategies? Uh-oh.
I think there's been some discussion of techniques in de-escalation, especially in trying to show up to that conversation. And I completely respect and honor Sabina's right to walk away from somebody who's not trying to have a conversation, who probably still wants to be heard and still wants to be seen, but is not trying to hear back. So that's not a conversation. So there's the question of there's the intention to want to talk to those who are, when we talk about voters who are undecided voters, trying to talk to those in the middle, right, in a spectrum. But that's only insofar as you understand this as a widening, as one or the other. In which case, if we focus on the center all the time and the scale and the spectrum by how people identify, maybe politically or on certain topics, if that keeps expanding, we're actually going to grow further and further apart and start to create separate little communities. So we're not talking about one spectrum of people, as has been mentioned. It's not a monolith. We're talking about separate communities forming, and they identifying very closely with each other in their own little communities. Sometimes in research, it's referred to as homophily, which basically means like attracts like. You will be more associated and willing to listen to people who feel like they belong to your tribe. And if you create new tribes, then there's that space to join that tribe, to be like, these people get me. It's the same reason that we get along with people who have similar interests as us, like similar hobbies. As that happens, some of those will come in, there will be friction amongst some of these tribes. But understanding then, and this is also something that was brought up earlier, that we're not just dealing with what messages we should be saying that can address everybody, but also how people feel about issues and how they self-identify. Messing with people's worldviews doesn't seem to work, even if we're not trying to. If you tell someone something that completely clashes with the way they understand their own reality, they won't. It's not that they don't hear what you're saying, it does not get accepted. And it's not necessarily that they're stupid or stubborn or ignorant. Sometimes it's a self-defense mechanism. I can't hear something that doesn't make sense with what I believe, because maybe their sense of identity is tied to what they believe. For instance, in the case of religion, that can be very strong, and a very strong reason that someone says, I can't actually accept or take in what you're telling me that twists my sense of self and my worldview. So that is when identity comes up as a major topic of conversation and something to take into account when we're trying to do science communication.
That's a thread I very much want to pick up on, because I've had this suspicion for a while now that science communicators might be focusing on the wrong problem when we're trying to work with public that are on the extreme or in the middle or wherever they are. I think that science communicators assume that when we're communicating on social media, that what we're trying to do is share propositions, facts about how the world works, truth. And what we're seeing again and again is that like we feel as though facts don't matter, right? Like they seem to just bounce off people. It doesn't affect people's behavior. We know this from the data. We can correct somebody's misperception, but it has no effect, literally no measurable effect on their behavior. And I think it might be because we're focusing on the wrong problem. I think that maybe social media is designed to not to share facts, but to get us to express our identities, because then they can extract information about our identities and sell it to advertisers. And so it's really optimized for the expression of identity. And if you're playing the facts game in an identity space, then you're gonna be bumping your head up against the wall the way that we feel like we have been. Should we be focusing on an identity as scientists rather than just communicating facts to people?
I would posit that facts are fundamental. I would say in the environment particularly around science discourse, and that's inclusive of the misinformation out there, you have to always understand what the opposing side is also saying, and they speak in absolutes. Right? Absolutes, yes, that vaccine will kill your baby. This vaccine is poisonous, it contains mercury. Those are cold-hearted facts that people respond to with a lot of confidence. Scientists, on the other hand, will say, we have no evidence that proves this will kill you. So it may not kill you. We have not enough data to show clear safety in pregnant women for this particular vaccine. So you're dealing with a language that is scientifically in line, but it's not speaking the language that people want to hear, and it's not speaking with the amount of magnitude and force that the opponent side is speaking. So that's, I'd say, issue number one. So facts do matter, but it's also around how are you communicating it, and are you delivering it in a way where you're actually shifting how they feel about the subject, right? So how do you make it relevant? How do you frame it? So the other day, someone's like, and this is another aspect, they said, do you actually believe climate disaster is real? And I said, well, I am involved with the scientific community. I've seen enough of the data, I believe so. But that's not, to me, that's not the best way to convince this person. I said, well, can you get insurance on your home in a coastal area? You can't anymore. So can you get fire insurance in a dry, arid area now that is now becoming more prone to forest fires? No, those insurance companies won't do it. So you speak in that commercial language to say, if you don't believe me, you don't want to believe the scientists, then believe those insurance companies. All they want to do is, it's free market capitalism, right? They only want to make a buck. They're going to protect their losses. And so if you can't get insured in these things, do you think those insurance companies don't believe climate change is real? Or do you believe those insurance companies are covering their own asses because it's a made-up thing? And so you can turn them around to say, oh, okay, well, I've never framed it that way. So yes, that argument made sense because it's in the language that I appreciate. Talk to me about dollars and cents, money, whatever.
Yeah. What I really like about that example is that invoking an insurance salesman is a sort of nonpartisan way of approaching a problem, right? It's not
pretty partisan. It's
not left or right coded, depending on your audience. And so, but I want to push back a little bit and get more of your thoughts on this, because the strongest predictor for COVID preventative behaviors during the pandemic in the United States was not education. It wasn't how educated they were, what they knew about science. The strongest predictor was partisan identity. Are you a Democrat or a Republican? And more than that, there were several Republican districts in the United States where people were getting vaccinated secretly. To me, that doesn't make sense.
RFK Jr.'s entire family.
Sorry?
RFK Jr.'s entire family's vaccinated.
To me, that doesn't make sense if getting vaccinated is an indicator of what you believe about the effectiveness of vaccines. It only makes sense if instead getting vaccinated is a symbol of your identity. If you walk out of the doctor's office with a Band-Aid on your arm, it says, and you're in the Republican district and you're Republican, it says to other Republicans, I am not one of you. And so that comes with genuine social consequences. If that seems weird to you because you lean a different way politically, imagine walking into your office on Monday morning with a red hat on. You're probably in a lot of trouble, right? And so I wonder about the effect of identity in driving behavior. Like, my suspicion is that people tend to prioritize identity over science.
I think where you're leading to now is not about the evidence and the discourse. You're aligned to how specific narratives are aligned to political ideology. And I think particular with vaccine, it was a very convenient anti-governmental, anti-regulation narrative that allowed a specific political party or political ideology, whether it's libertarian or whatnot, to essentially drive that narrative further. If you don't believe in big government, why are you taking a vaccine that the government told you to do? Right? And it's similar to what I was going to mispronounce your name again.
Lychee.
Lychee, I was going to call you Tachi.
Yeah.
But it's similar to what you were saying earlier around, now I've lost my train of thought because I don't know your name. But it was what you earlier had said around, shoot, I'm going fog brain here.
Well, you were talking about the idea of if you're anti-big pharma and big government, then why are you going to take that vaccine?
It becomes more around this narrative of how you are anti, like particularly around in storytelling we sign it by like characters by different, we call them status, right? So they've been fostered into community where you will not take lower status than the government, right? So they're seen as in comedy, one plays high status, they're the ones making jokes. The low status person is the one making jokes upwards. So that's considered a socially acceptable form of humor because you're punching up, right? So people have been incubated in these communities to believe that the government is punching down on them. And so this whole notion of, I don't accept authority because I feel oppressed by you, I feel marginalized, or I feel that you've taken supports away from me, is how it's been incorporated and weaponized. So it's not necessarily that people were inherently vaccine, like anti-vaxxers. They were skeptical or they were hesitant, but they've now wrapped that into an identity politics mechanism, which galvanizes them into the political party that they want them to be.
Right, so the idea is that the belief then leads them into an identity that, and that identity determines the behavior. Not exactly.
The identity is what reinforces the behavior.
Right, okay.
So the behavior, if you're fearful of vaccines, you can capitalize that to say you're fearful of the vaccines and you're also fearful of big government. So the government's telling you this, vaccines are a weapon of theirs, and you need to reject it.
Sabina, I can see you want to jump in here.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. So the way I've seen it is that, yes, there's polarization based on party lines, but it's actually driven by people who have big budgets, and they're doing this intentionally. So, I mean, I don't think we can solve it. I think there are people out there who should be solving it. First of all, social media companies, where's the accountability on their front? But governments themselves, right? If you're looking at where all this misinformation the last 6 months is coming from, it's coming from the top health institutions in the US. Why are they doing this? Because they benefit from it, because there are people who are pushing these narratives so that they can actually make a big buck. How much did RFK Jr. make last year? $10 million. He's not doing this because this is what he thinks or because he actually cares about the health of people. No, he cares about how much money he's lining his pocket with. And the reason why people are pushing these narratives is because there's something in there for them financially, right? It's not about science. It's about how can we actually profit and monetize this.
Well, I mean, if we take that idea seriously, some people do quite like RFK Jr. I don't know how many are here. Don't put your hands up. But
There better
some
be
people,
no hands in a faculty.
But I mean, this is part of the point, right? Is we have to figure out how to talk with these different kinds of people, and we really want to try to rebuild some of the trust in the institution that it sounds like is fading from at least the perspective of a few people, probably many, if our goal is to get people to trust these institutions, do we want them to, what do we mean by that? Do we want blind trust? When we say that we want them to trust science, who do we mean by that? Because right now, the Secretary of Health in the United States is not somebody who necessarily everybody in the sciences trusts. So how do average people decide what they're supposed to do from a health perspective when they're trying to decide if they're going to get a vaccine or take Tylenol? Like, what do we mean when we say we're trying to build trust in science?
I was gonna say I think diversifying the sources of information would really help, because certainly there are reasons to mistrust, but it's not that it's difficult to get people to trust. But if trust is broken, regaining trust is extremely difficult, and trying to convince people to come back around, especially when they feel maybe if they feel political reasons to disassociate from information, can be difficult as well. In which case, I think that the way I would come about this is to, and I think maybe I'm speaking about this from the perspective of a researcher, is to ask them not to trust not to necessarily turn to singular sources of information, even if it's the government or public health or their own doctor, but to look for varying sources of information, and also to look for ones that are grounded in research. Now, I recognize what's wrong with that suggestion, which is that not all of it is accessible, and not all of it is made to be. That can also feel like its own form of like punching down, because it's sort of like experts trying to tell people what's good for them. In which case, it's also their job, and I mean this also for myself, it's also in my capacity, my job, to make sure that I don't feel like I'm bigger than my britches and talking down to people. In that sense, when I'm doing something for in science communication in a few weeks. It's a talk, but I specifically requested, like when they had proposed, like, do you want it more of a workshop? Do you want do you want a Q&A? And there was the idea that we might be able to do an interactive workshop in which I could send people off into groups to do an activity. And I thought that would be best, because I can give them the tools and the language to have the conversation, but now they can also feel like they can use that language to empower themselves, and in that sense, trust themselves with that research. There's a field called citizens, or let's say a type of practice called citizen science, in which people are allowed to go out and look for the evidence themselves, including of how much rainfall changes and varies over the years, measuring the temperature of the average monthly temperature and rainfall over the years, especially in the summer, and what impact does that have on what they're seeing with natural disasters. Empowering people to trust themselves, I think, is a big part of that as well. Understanding that this can't all be top down, and it can't even necessarily be all on one level, but that there have to be a variety of different approaches that allow people to feel like they're engaged, that they understand, that they're not being excluded. But that also might be cultural. I think in some cases we may see instances in which people like to be told, just tell me what to do. But in others, it's like, I want to find out for myself. So offering a variety may be able to speak to more people and the different ways in which they want to come to trust something and to understand things.
Lychee, I completely agree with you. So I was going to basically echo everything you said. But so I did a whole slew of interviews on the whole Tylenol and pregnancy thing.
I can imagine. Yeah, it was a busy week for you.
Because my degree is in teratology, which is, what can affect the fetus. And the thing and that question came up all the time, well, this information is coming from the FDA. How do you respond to that? And my go-to response to that is consensus. Consensus is so important, because consensus is what we use when we look at the totality of the evidence, we look at the totality of the data, and then we actually come to what we think is the best response to it, right? Consensus with the Tylenol clearly said, globally, like we had Canadian organizations, American organizations, European organizations, all saying one thing, except for this one specific person who was saying the complete opposite thing, right? And then the second part of that is also teaching people, like you said, how to actually critically evaluate. So I have this one post that kind of takes people into what do you need to look into to critically evaluate if something makes sense or not. And when I have DMs, and I get over 100 DMs daily, and half of them are people asking me, hey, did you watch this video? Can you tell me whether this is real or not?
Yeah.
I actually respond back and say, here's my post, it's pinned. Take a look through this post and take a look at what you just sent me, and then come back and let's have a conversation. And I do that work with people all the time because I want them to actually be able to look at that video when I'm not there, you know, whatever, 10 years down the road, or share it with a friend and be able to actually tell whether they should be putting any trust in that video or not.
Yeah,
Right?
teach them to fish, don't give them fish. I love that.
Exactly
yeah.
that.
Well, so Calvin, I want to ask you, because I'm aware that the microphones are moving around, and I want to get to your questions very shortly. My last question to you will be, you know, what should we be doing if we're trying to figure out how to trust, who to trust, and how to know? Like, what are the things you do when you're deciding who to trust?
It's a tricky. There's no absolute in it. I'd say people trust people most like themselves.
Yep.
And I think for organizations and institutions, there's an acknowledgement that trust is a byproduct of engagement. So we need to invest in engagement, put resources, deploy funds, get it staffed so that we can engage with the communities that we want to target and specifically that we want to either counter or develop those relationships with. Often they're marginalized communities, often they're socioeconomically deprived communities. Those are important because in public health, you always have to support, quote unquote, the most disadvantaged group, right? It's just how the whole equation works. The second component, I'd say, and I'm not gonna lose my train of thought this
Okay, we'll see.
is also really understand your audience. Number one, there are good faith actors, there are bad faith actors, and there are people who are intentionally malicious in intent. And I think we talked a bit about we don't want to sound too conspiratorial on it, but there are funds, and some of this investigation work I've done, there are deliberate groups that are sowing distrust in science as a weapon for industrial gain. So denying climate change, dismantling regulations, breeding distrust in government and all sorts of institutions. So those are the malicious sort of actors. But the bad faith actors is also to recognize, because that is a massive community, online community that is bubbling up, that I'd say a lot of people in the science community do not have any understanding of how this community operates. They are deliberate troublemakers. They go out there and they live on these communities where they deliberately want to create chaos. They go out and they bring back social media clout. They bring back retweets. They say, I just got retweeted by RFK Jr. because I said some outrageous thing about vaccines and he liked it. So they're out there deliberately doing that, not because they believe in science or not, because they are troublemakers. It's a whole online troll culture.
Yeah.
So it's really understanding who do you want to target and who you want to move. Those people have behavioral issues. They need to get out of the basement. They need to, meet some social life. Sorry, that sounds really derogative. But then you also need to recognize who are the middle movers, because those are the ones that you really want to spend a lot of time discussing and making sure that they're comforted. That's where challenging disinformation, countering all that stuff is really vital. And then
Mike.
The last component is really, sorry, just to finish that one, you need to amplify the people who convert. So people who go from skepticism to say, I've had a positive experience with this interface in health or with this institution, you need to raise their voices so that other people who similarly are skeptical can be led into a more truthful pathway. And
Piper effect.
Right, and that's where we also need to put, and a lot of the film work that I do is like that. We take people who have either lost their way or have had a health trauma, and then we show that there's a pathway back into better health, better care. And those are positive stories that hopefully will take people who are recognized. whether they're having some sort of trauma or negativity, to say there is a positive pathway instead of a destructive, negative, disinformation sort of pathway, i.e., by distrusting, by hating, by whatever.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought it back somewhere positive, because that was getting quite dystopian for a minute there. So I think with that, then we'll open it to the floor and let you ask all of your fascinating questions. I know there's a microphone out there somewhere.
As science communicators, we're storytellers, and I'd like to know what value you think there would be in telling histories of the past. And specifically, I'm thinking about you will go around Toronto and you'll see ads for PrEP, which is for preventing HIV transmission. So in this neighborhood, I grew up in this neighborhood in the 80s, and there were signs everywhere saying silence equals death. And those were put up by ACT UP, who was determined that, the people in this neighborhood affected by HIV were not going to sit down and shut up. They were going to speak out and form things like CANFAR, the Canadian Foundation for AIDS Research. And that research, scientific research, led to treatments like PrEP to prevent HIV prevention. So my question is, as science communicators, should we be telling those stories to try to regain trust about the history of how science has benefited different groups?
Maybe Alaichi, does highlighting all of our wins, is that an effective strategy, do you think?
I think it is certainly one effective strategy, but the one reason that it's useful is because I think those narratives carry further and are more important for people than me trying to force someone to understand how RNA works. It's just more, it makes so much more sense, and there can be so many stories that come out of that, including ones that touch people personally, to make them think, oh, this affects me as well, and all of a sudden that personal connection might be more impactful to understanding the trend of things, including how things have developed. So yes, the short answer, yes.
Go ahead.
I think it's double-edged. I think there are wonderful, positive outcomes of a lot of historical activism, particularly with communities that are fighting for their survival, essentially. I think there also are very negative health stories. This Tuskegee experiment, like there are a whole bunch of terrible, heinous examples as well. So I think in an avoidance of cherry picking, because cherry picking is what disinformation, misinformation is fundamentally built on, you also have to be mindful of that. So I'd say go in with intention of what story you want and who you want to help activate or lift in those, or educate and engage with in those communities. But you can't whitewash it. You can't present a false illusion of a glorious past, or look how far we've come, because we still continue to trip up. I'd say we're in a live example of the medical and the public health being completely, I'd say, vandalized in the U.S. So I think you just need to be very choiceful.
So probably something then like a combination of storytelling with transparency, that we've made mistakes, but here's where we're at.
Yeah, and transparency, absolutely. That word needs to be fundamental in how we communicate. I mean, that's come up a lot in the learnings in the film that I did about vaccine hesitancy. It's being able to speak clearly of, yeah, we've made a mistake, we didn't know, we know more now, and
Right.
This is why we're talking to you. So that level of transparency, the public health sector, the SciComm people need to be active on that level in a very iterative and an engaged live type of perspective, which is
Okay.
pretty much where we have Sabina doing that legwork for.
But it's interesting because in the research that I'm doing, one of the themes that came up was transparency is credibility. It is so
that's right.
tied in, and there's so many aspects to it. Absolutely, one of them is making sure you're owning up to your mistakes and you're not whitewashing, or you're not, you're speaking the truth. The other aspect of that actually came up is about who is giving that message. Who is the person behind the message? Is that person someone with a human face, can I actually trust who that person is? And it was the exact same when I was doing the vaccine education sessions for the racialized communities. Because even though I would give an hour and a half long, how do vaccines work, why you should get vaccinated, the question would be, have you been vaccinated? And so I started off with actually showing a picture of my dad and I my dad's immunocompromised, showing us getting vaccinated at the pop-up that the Punjabi Community Health Services put.
Wow.
Us getting vaccinated together actually moved the needle a lot more than, the jargon, the facts that I, as a scientist, love to throw at people. But transparency is credibility.
I love that story. And I think, following people who admit when they're wrong is a really good way to decide if I'm going to trust you or not. I think somebody in the green shirt here, jacket here.
Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful discussion. I had a question about repair after harm. In like a partnership, for example, when someone messes up, there's a bit of a weird period afterward where there's like a cast on the relationship and things are a little bit extra and there's a lot of careful attention. That's not how things are going to be long term. But in that short little period, it's really important where you acknowledge, this is what happened, I understand why it hurt you, I'm going to do this, till you feel better. What could it look like, what that you've seen, what should it look like for that sort of cast, we don't want to do it forever, but maybe right now period to invest in for that engagement?
Great question. Who wants to take that one? So the question was, for those who didn't hear then, what does repair after harm look like? You have a fight with your partner, there's a weird period where you're figuring out how you make things better, it's not forever. What does that look like for science? If we make mistakes, after Tuskegee, then what does repair after harm look like there?
Honestly, in my opinion, you don't stop talking about it because as we've seen with history, it keeps happening. And so I think things have to constantly be talked about, constantly be taught. I talk about this at home with my 8-year-old because I want to make sure that as he's growing up, he understands the mistakes that we've made in the past so that his generation does not make the same mistakes again. So, I think this is not something you put a tick mark and you say, okay, done, let's move on. I think it's something we have to work on constantly over and over again and make sure we don't make those mistakes again.
This is where I tend to think the institutional guardrails become helpful. My background is in psychology, and I remember the experiments we read about when I was coming through school were like, the Phillips and Bardo's experiments, the Stanford prison experiments, or Milgram's experiment. It was just the Wild West, man. They were doing whatever they wanted to people. It was crazy. What a golden time that was. But now you have research ethics boards that say you're going to traumatize these people, and you're not allowed to do it. Does that strike you as an important part of the repair after harm kind of thing, or how do you think about it?
I think a lot of it has to do with framing, because you don't want to say, I completely agree that transparency is important, including in how, even in representing, as one of the earlier questions had asked, like representing earlier stories, but representing history relative to today, including what had happened relative to what we can learn and how we move forward. In which case, paired with transparency, then I would also say accountability. It's not self-flagellation, oh, I didn't know better, blah, 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 but also here's what we've gained, here's the data that we know based on this mistake. How do we use this to our advantage so this doesn't happen again? And I think even in conversations in repair in conversations of repair in general, the idea is to try your best to prevent this from happening again. And I think that's the only promise that can actually be made. Not that it won't happen again, but it's like, we know what happened, we'll do everything, and we know, and we're learning more, and we're gonna do everything in our power to kind of mitigate this and lower the chances in the future. But that happens with every story, even the really awful ones. It's like, I can't believe we let this happen. How do we learn? But not without, but also at the same time, not saying, here are a million examples of the times that we messed up. It's like, okay, what did we learn? How do we move forward? So in that sense, the history or the past is only useful insofar as we can use it to project a better future.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
I think
That's why you're here.
I think you need to, it's not just the acknowledgement and the sort of reparations, it's how do you structurally design your systems to prevent this from happening.
Yeah.
Things like inclusion, things like equity, things like making sure that those in the decision-making circle, those who are leading to the design, those who are determining what the outputs should look like and who the communities they need to service, those people are all invited to the table. And so it is a structural change.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do that structure, you're just going to repeat it.
Yeah, if my cell phone blew up, I appreciate your apology, but did you change the design so it doesn't explode again?
The system's the same, it's going to happen again.
We did that, like you said, with the research ethics board. Like we had the whole issue with
Right.
thalidomide in pregnancy that caused a whole bunch
That's
of
right.
issues. That was a turning point for research in
Yeah.
Canada, right? It was a massive turning point.
Yeah.
And it was something that I was taught in school. I was taught when we did our clinical trials in the pregnant population, and we still continue to do it.
I saw a hand here. I want to try to get as many. How much time do we have left? I want to get as many as we can. 10. Okay, cool. So we'll go here, and then I saw one over there.
We talked about research. Some of us fear that research is because it needs funding, and those who fund the research have a vested interest. So how do we remove this fear?
It depends on if it's industry research versus, let's say, academic research. So industry researchers are always going to have the upper edge on academic researchers, and particularly. So, for instance, in Canada, we rely on most of our universities are public, so we rely on public funding as well for research that we submit proposals for. So all of that is peer reviewed and chosen based on merit, but there can also be bias there. So what, for instance, are the Canadian research tri-agencies privileging in a certain year? And I can tell you, for instance, AI is really big right now for them. Of course, they want to get ahead of things, but especially like when it comes to research and trust, we're not, like, academic researchers will not catch up with industry researchers. I'm talking about, if I work on AI versus if someone at Google works on AI, they have billions of dollars at their disposal, whereas I have to go through the process of applying and making sure that there is an ethics review board, there is a conversation, and now that work will be done maybe I shouldn't say that industry researchers are not held to the same standard, because we attend the same conferences. It's just that they can do so much more and so much faster. And often the degree of content and the speed of their content reaches ears faster, in which case it's a question of understanding how to get our messages out there in other ways. And so, for instance, coming here to speak to you tonight is a lot faster than me trying to publish a paper that, 4 people and my mom might read.
I'd read it.
So,
I loved it, darling. It was a great paper.
yeah. Thinking about that making things feel like, including conversations about research, feel a little bit more accessible is important, because all of that happens behind closed doors. Like, who knows which universities are working on what actually we do, because the tri-agencies list every year what the projects are that they funded and how much money was received, so you can see where your tax dollars are going in that sense. But I don't know what's going on behind the doors of Alphabet and Google and Amazon and Netflix and whatever, or not Netflix, what am I saying? They don't do research. Or probably user research, but with this sort of in the same vein or the same field as me. OpenAI, for instance, what are they doing? But I will tell you, like, they've got billions of dollars that I do not have to do this research. And it's not that I don't trust them, it's just that I've got to get a little bit more creative about my own research and making sure that people trust me.
Thanks for your discussion. Sorry, I arrived like 10 minutes late, so my apologies if you already brought that up.
Hakuna Matata, dude.
I'm a history nerd, so I guess I kind of look at it from a historical point of view. In the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, trust was an all-time high, and then suddenly something changes in the 60s and 70s, and now we're at an all-time low. Seems like stuff that happened in the 60s, Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate scandal, which then the President Richard Nixon resigned. Sorry, these are all US stuff. I don't know too much about Canada, but it seems like the Cold War stuff, propaganda, those changed our path in a way that we're still dealing with the trauma of it. We still have that PTSD. and trust lowered and lowered after that, and now we're at all-time low. And then other things that happened after that, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of that. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, like, what do you think about that? The other thing is, one of you mentioned that it's different not trusting an authoritarian government. It's not the same saying that I don't trust the Russian government regarding vaccination versus another, let's say, democratic country. The irony is many of these authoritarian regimes have been extremely successful in things such as vaccination.
Yeah.
Let's say the example of Cuba. Cuba is a country that has a dark history of human rights now, one of the worst in the world, one of the worst economies. It's under sanctions, but its public health is doing magnificently well. Each neighborhood has a free community clinic, vaccinations rates all-time high. So its GDP compared to its neighbor, the US, is not even comparable, but its public health is so much better. Or many African countries, they did so well in terms of the COVID vaccination rates, although they do it with force. You either get vaccinated or go to jail, but they did it. So I don't know whether the mean justifies the end or no, I don't know. That's a philosophical discussion, but I thought
It's actually not a philosophical question. It's actually very much rooted in public health, right? So if you look at one of the tenets of public health is the Nuffield ladder of interventions, and basically that's exactly what it is. What level of intervention do we need to actually get the population to adopt a specific intervention, right? And the goal always is the least possible amount of control and force, right? And the reason for that is because you might convince people using force to, for instance, get your vaccines, but you're not building trust in the process. And so when we were talking about the COVID-19 vaccines and we were talking about having these mandatory passports, I was actually pretty vocally against it. Because yes, we can convince people to get their 2 doses, but we are not going to convince them to get their annual shots. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. So it's not actually philosophical. In fact, it is very supremely important in public health that we try every possible thing before we actually get to the control and force, because we're actually not convincing people and we're not building trust. And so doing things like actually encouraging them to get vaccinated, doing things like explaining why it's important, and the positive, more positive, what's the word I'm looking for? Positive, yes, benefits of like actually getting vaccinated actually end up having so much more sway long term than being forceful on that day off. And I spoke when we were vaccinating people, some of the folks who would come up and say they actually distrusted the COVID-19 vaccine actually came from countries outside of Canada where they did see this occur, and they wanted to know, how are we actually trusting Health Canada so like with our eyes, shut? And that carries forward because some of that ends up being generational trauma as well. So anyways, I think it's actually not philosophical. It's very much public health related, and we have to be very thoughtful and impactful on how we actually do public health interventions because of this. I personally don't. I think that there has to be an art and a science in convincing people.
Yeah,
and it
there's a
doesn't always
balance.
have to be a hammer.
But that is a commentary on the inherent trust in the system. Do I force you because no one trusts the system? Or do I offer you and you accept it because you have enough trust in the system? And I think what we did learn through the pandemic is people who came from, and this is one of the most unaddressed populations in Canada, people who came from the Eastern Bloc of Europe, under tyrannical regimes and lots of dysfunction there, they had the worst trust. And because they identified as Caucasian, they were unaddressed. There was no visible ethnic line that people could be delineating, right? So again, that's another gap in the system where without sophisticated sort of understanding of different population communities, that you're going to lose them.
Picking up on an idea that you also expanded on, you pointed out that trust seemed to vary and really dip after the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I wonder if in the data we have on trajectories in Canada, if it goes that far back, do we know how Canadians felt that long ago?
I can say that the Trust Network has not done research as far, like historically in that regard, but actually, as somebody whose training is in this field, I can tell you, not one singular event, but I think a lot of it has to do with media form. And the reason I say that is because after, for instance, I'm going to use the US as an example, unfortunately, but then use it as an extension, like historically, but think about what that might mean for Canada. Historically, during the Great Depression in the 29 and the 1930s, there was a great deal of suffering, of course, and also a sort of reunification of the people and eventual re-strengthening of the economy through public messages delivered by Roosevelt over the radio, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, what changed? Like, that's great, and people would say, like, I just heard him and I felt better. I felt like I could, like, trust him, and he had my best interests at heart, and I could put my money back in the bank. But if you fast forward a few decades later, when you're describing all these political scandals that are happening in the 60s, that is also parallel to what is happening in the civil rights movement, and with a lot more representation of previously
Unrepresented folks.
and historically underrepresented and oppressed peoples, but also the Vietnam War. Now, I'm using media as an example because the Vietnam War is the first, and I would bet money on it, the last war to ever be televised because it created so much mistrust. The Vietnam War compared to the Second World War, compared to the First World War, there was no glory in watching it happen, right? Instead of being able to frame it as like a sort of cultural narrative, and you see people come back or they don't come back, and then there's mistrust in that, but there's still a unification of the sense of the country and patriotism, versus when you are watching it happen, it was so horrific and caused especially the youth to say, like, why are we doing this? And caused protests and a division between people who were against war and those who might have been enforcing it. Now, if you just continue that, the sources of information are starting to be dispersed, and it starts to become noise. Literally, like, information overload. Like, what am I supposed to trust anymore? There's no one, like, godlike figure who just tells me what to do. It's just confusion, and then people start to take matters and power back into their own hands, and that's when I think we're starting to see people looking for ways to make themselves feel safe and in control, and that can sometimes look like bad faith actors, but it can also look like good agents, like good faith actors. But anyway, there's just, I think that the history of media and how that works also now in Canada is a big factor in how the people trust their government or not.
Well, I think what I can take from what you've shared there is the idea that for the American public, they were being told this war is great while they were seeing with their eyes that it wasn't. And so that idea of transparency seems indispensable to building trust. And that seems to have run across the theme for a lot of tonight, that and make sure that you care about the people that you engage with, because it seems to be really important. Do you want to have the final word on this?
I would caution around the fantastical nostalgia of a brighter past. I just think as a general principle, I think it's all relative, and I think it's about who was polled and what artifacts have been maintained and preserved. Because I don't think it was always as trustful. I think it might have been more hidden because, McCarthyism and all that, right? So again, be cautious with trying to benchmark history with the present.
Well, I cannot think of a more vaguely ominous way to end an event called Trust Issues than that. So that sounds like a great place to end things. I want to thank all of you for sticking around and for giving the audience here, or our panelists, your attention. We'll give them a round of applause for their participation, and a round of applause for yourselves as well. Thank you so much.